The first time I saw Margaret, she was standing very still beside her mailbox. It was early morning. The sky was pale and quiet. The kind of quiet that feels almost heavy. I had just moved into the small rental house next door, carrying a cardboard box filled with dishes I wasn't sure I would ever use. Margaret looked at me without smiling, not in a cold way, just in a thoughtful way. She was 70 years old, maybe a little more. Her silver hair was always pinned neatly. At the back of her head, she wore long skirts and soft sweaters, even in warm weather. There was something steady about her, like she had been standing in that same spot for years, watching the world move around her. I nodded politely. "Good morning." She tilted her head slightly. "Morning," she said in a calm, even voice. That was all. At the time, I didn't know her words would stay with me for months. I didn't know that one afternoon she would look directly at me and say, "Watch closely." And I wouldn't be ready for what came next. I moved to that neighborhood because it was cheap. After the divorce, cheap was all I could manage. My name is Daniel Harper. I used to believe my life would follow a straight line. College, marriage, career, children. But somewhere between long work hours and quiet arguments in the kitchen, that line bent sharply. Now it was just me in a two-bedroom house that felt too big and too empty at the same time. I worked remotely, which meant most days I sat at my small dining table, staring at a laptop screen. I spoke to clients on video calls. I sent emails. I pretended everything was fine. But when the calls ended, the silence returned. That was when I started noticing Margaret more. Every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, she stepped into her backyard. She carried a small wooden stool and a metal watering can. She would sit beside a narrow flower bed that ran along the fence, and she would water each plant slowly. Very slowly. I could see her from my kitchen window. She never rushed. She never looked bored. She moved with intention, as if every drop of water mattered. At first, I thought it was strange. Who spends that much time on a few flowers? But over the weeks, watching her became part of my routine. I would close my laptop at 4. I would make coffee, and I would stand by the window. Margaret would already be there, watering, pausing, touching the soil gently with her fingers. Sometimes she would speak softly, though I couldn't hear the words. I told myself it was harmless curiosity. But the truth was, her steady presence made the afternoons feel less empty. One Thursday the sky turned grey and heavy. Rain clouds gathered quickly. The air felt tight. I expected Margaret to skip her routine. But at 4 o'clock, she stepped outside anyway. No umbrella, no coat. Just her sweater and her watering can. The first drops of rain fell as she sat on her stool. I frowned. The plants didn't need water, not with the storm coming, but she poured anyway, slowly, carefully. The rain grew stronger. I felt restless watching her. Finally, I stepped outside. "Margaret," I called over the sound of rain, "you don't need to water them. It's about to pour." She didn't look annoyed. She didn't even look surprised that I had come over. She simply glanced at me and smiled faintly. "Watch closely," she said. That was it. Then she pointed toward the flower bed. I hesitated, rain soaking into my shirt, but I stepped closer. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just damp soil, small green stems, a few pale buds, not yet open. Then I noticed her hand. She wasn't just watering randomly. She was pouring water into tiny, shallow circles she had pressed into the dirt earlier. Small basins around each root. The rain was falling hard now, but the water she poured went directly where it needed to go. "Most people think rain is enough," she said calmly. But rain spreads everywhere. It doesn't always reach deep. I crouched beside her. She gently pressed the soil around one plant. Roots need patience, she said. Not just water. I didn't understand why her words felt heavier than they should, but I kept watching. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. Roots need patience, not just water. I started noticing how rushed my own life had become. After the divorce, I tried to fix everything quickly. I joined dating apps. I signed up for online courses. I filled my evenings with noise, television, podcasts, music, anything to avoid the quiet. I was pouring rain everywhere, but maybe nothing was reaching deep. One afternoon I saw Margaret struggling slightly with her stool. Without thinking, I walked over. "Let me help you with that." She nodded once. "Thank you, Daniel." It was the first time she had used my name. It was the first time she had used my name. We sat in silence for a while. She watered. I watched. Finally, I asked, "Why do you care so much about these flowers?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed to the smallest plant in the corner. "That one was almost dead when I planted it," she said. "Broken stem. Weak roots." I leaned closer. It looked fragile compared to the others. "Why not replace it?" I asked. Margaret smiled softly. "Because it wasn't done trying." Her words landed somewhere deep in my chest. That night, I opened an old photo album I hadn't touched in months. Pictures from before everything fell apart. My ex-wife smiling in the kitchen. Me standing beside her, younger and confident. We had stopped trying long before we admitted it. I closed the album gently. The next day, I did something I hadn't done since moving in. I called my sister. We had grown distant after the divorce. I had been too proud to admit I was struggling. The call was awkward at first, small talk, long pauses, but then I told her the truth. I haven't been okay. She didn't judge me. She didn't rush to fix anything. She just listened. When we hung up, the house felt different. Not full, exactly, but softer. That afternoon, at 4 o'clock, I joined Margaret without waiting for an invitation. She handed me the watering can. "Watch closely," she repeated. This time, I understood she didn't mean the flowers. She meant life. Weeks passed. The small, fragile plant began to change. Its stem straightened. Tiny leaves grew stronger. One morning, a pale pink bud appeared. I felt an unexpected wave of pride, even though I had done very little. Margaret noticed my expression. "You see," she said gently. I nodded. "Yes, but what I saw wasn't just a flower. I saw patience. I saw quiet care. I saw that healing wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, almost invisible, until one day it wasn't. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret seemed unusually tired. Her movements were slower, her breathing slightly heavier. "Are you okay?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "I'm 70, Daniel. I get tired." But there was something more in her eyes, something distant. The next afternoon, she didn't come outside at 4. I waited by the window. 4:15, 4:30. No Margaret. A tight feeling grew in my chest. Finally, I walked next door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. After a long moment, the door opened slowly. Margaret stood there, leaning slightly on the frame. "I was just resting," she said. Relief washed over me. "Can I help with the flowers today?" I asked. She studied my face carefully. Then she nodded. "Watch closely," she said again. We walked to the backyard together. She didn't sit this time. She simply stood beside me as I poured water into the small basins. My movements were careful now, intentional. After a while, she spoke quietly. and started this garden after my husband passed. I paused. I'm sorry. She nodded gently. For a long time, I didn't want to water anything, didn't want to try, but plants don't ask for much, just attention. She looked at me, and they give back in ways you don't expect. I swallowed. I think you've been teaching me more than gardening. She smiled fully for the first time since I had met her. That was the idea. The few days later, the fragile plant bloomed toward the sun. It wasn't the biggest flower in the garden, not the brightest. But it felt like a quiet victory. Margaret stood beside me. Beautiful, she whispered. There were tears in her eyes, though she didn't seem sad. I realized then that she hadn't just been watering flowers. She had been preparing me, teaching me how to stay, how to care without rushing, how to watch closely. That evening, I cooked dinner for both of us. Nothing fancy. Just soup and bread. We ate slowly at her small kitchen table. Before I left, she placed her hand lightly on my arm. Daniel, she said, life doesn't need to be loud to be meaningful. I nodded. I know, and for the first time in months, I truly meant it. Margaret still waters her garden at 4 o'clock. Some days I join her. Some days I simply watch Fro. The window. The silence in my house no longer feels heavy. It feels like space. Space to grow. Space to try again. I've started reconnecting with friends. I've started writing in the evenings. Not because I'm trying to fix my life overnight, but because I'm willing to tend to it slowly, like roots beneath the soil. Whenever I feel impatient, I remember her voice in the rain. Watch closely. And I do, because sometimes the most important changes are the ones that happen quietly right in front of us. And if we're patient enough to see them, we realize we weren't as broken as we thought. We were just waiting to bloom.